Poker machines have been nicknamed one-armed bandits in Australia for a surprisingly long time. In parts of the Chinese community, they're also called tiger machines. A report last year from Western Sydney University found almost $9 million a day is lost gambling in Western Sydney venues alone. And gambling-related harm isn't something you often see addressed in contemporary art or the art world, not the same way that other addictions linked so closely to corporate interests are. But poker machines are something Nelson Nee has been deeply impacted by. It drove him to make art in the first place and to create his latest installation work called I Bet You. Nelson is the artist behind this week's My Thing.
Hi, my name is Nelson, and my thing is using art to talk about gambling harm. So the role of gambling, I'd say, is quite a significant part in particularly families and communities in Western Sydney. It is a really sobering relationship. 54% of Sydney's population is in Western Sydney, yet 63% of electronic gaming machine losses occurs there. There were 3 local government areas within Western Sydney, and I live in one of them, and we only are 17% of Sydney's population, yet we account for 1/3 of Sydney's poker machine losses. So in a way, it just became part and parcel of my life, and that was all I knew. My lived experience of gambling harm isn't affected other occurred since the day I was born. The term tiger machine came from the translation of poker machine in English. So in Chinese, the characters are tiger and machine. And for me, that just really struck a chord because it emphasized the predatory nature of these machines and of gambling. And it was almost poetic in that the Chinese language had captured this whole environment and this whole feeling and connotation in just the character alone. I always knew that these venues and clubs played a big part because that was always where family members were. And so instead of being at the dinner table or being at, important events and knowing that they were at these clubs and venues, then starting to see that, as my life was sort of this constant cycle of worry and fear, all these venues and gambling, venues, they were becoming more and more glamorous. They kept getting more sophisticated and getting built up, and they were becoming these really 5-star glitzy resort-looking places, and it just felt like these two worlds that couldn't be more different. I Bet You is a multimedia installation that I created as part of the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture exhibition at Western Sydney University. So the installation is essentially a house, and that house represents both Australia's dream as well as Australia's nightmare. Through the house, I brought through my lived experience of gambling harm, where I have personally witnessed houses being lost due to gambling, and at the same time living through a period where home ownership is becoming a dream in Australia. It really presented this big paradox in my life. The house is individually tiled up with lottery tickets. The process of creating it was almost like building a house, and it took over 50 hours of manual tiling, where the whole house is covered in these lottery tickets that represent dreams, as well as a lot of the destruction that has been caused from gambling. Since they were legalised in 1956, in New South Wales at least, we became the first state to permit the poker machines in registered clubs. It's been a long journey and a long coming to terms for me in how I arrived at this point with my lived experience of gambling harm. and how it all began, even before I was born, really. So it's almost like an inheritance. I've thought about the team of experts that goes into creating these poker machines, and they are professionals in animation, in sound, in ergonomics, and so even psychology. It's almost this really twisted way of using these skills and yet to achieve a really horrific outcome. That also played into it, where I use a lot of vibrant colours and I like to sort of draw attention to textures, and that links back to the way that these machines are designed to captivate you and to draw you in. I started making art during the COVID lockdowns, which was a silver lining for me, because in that period I found that, you know, art had a real purpose, and it gave me a way to express things that I couldn't really do with words. And so then I started to tell my story and realized that art could be used, as a tool almost for social change, where you could amplify stories that were once silenced and draw attention, I guess, to this serious public health issue. Also really inspired by what had been done, what had been said about gambling harm through, the really famous Blow Up the Pokey song by the Whitlams. And that was almost a personal mantra for me. And so I took that on and started to work with those phrases and work with lyrics in the song, and conveyed that through paintings and through text-based experiments. So that's where I adorned the house with almost this sort of spell, of blow up the pokies. And it was really just knowing that I wasn't alone, maybe, in sort of identifying that there's something wrong here. I'd like to see ultimately this conversation continue, and the Alliance for Gambling Reform and Wesley Mission, they have key reform measures that include universal cashless gambling and also harm reduction measures. So with these, they include like regulation of the machines, where, there are a limit on bet sizes and a reduction in the speed of play. And a lot of these things would really limit and stop the gambling harm. I think the impact of my art on my loved ones is it's brought almost a peace, in that it's a coming to terms where, like in therapy, what you do is you talk. And so through my art, I talk and I say things that have never been said and that have been kept quiet for a long time. So I think it's chipping away at this shame and stigma that keeps us all in silence. And so I think it's a collective healing, as hard as it is as well while you're going through it. I think it's just being honest with yourself, and ultimately that's being honest with everyone else.
Nelson Nee. You can see his work, I Bet You, at the exhibition Individual and Universal, The World We Share, on at the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture in Parramatta, Sydney.